Welcome everyone to the first recorded lecture of Facing Human Wrongs. This module's theme is the denial of systemic violence. We're going to present two tools to help you analyze this week's material: the house modernity built and the soft, radical, and beyond reform cartography. We also call these frameworks toys, in that they are best approached in a way that allows us to acknowledge that we will fail in our analysis and in our understanding of these complex issues, and that's okay. That's part of the process. It's necessary to fail forward and be comfortable with coming back to the frameworks and receiving feedback in order to deepen our understanding. This iterative process is part of the layering process and progressing towards a deeper understanding of these complex issues. So be prepared for it. Don't feel too bad about it, and recognize that it's an inevitable part of going a bit deeper and layering. So I'm going to pass over to Vanessa, who will start us off with the house cartography.
Thank you, Will. So today we're going to present a story that is a social cartography. Social cartographies are maps that help us understand things that are difficult to sit with. And this is a particular one that was also workshopped with communities, with indigenous communities in the Global South. So it was a collectively built story. And it has 4 frames, and it's actually a longer story than the 4 frames that you see in front of you. And we're going to be telling you the stories in parts. So for today, we're going to look at these 4 frames, and the framework of soft, radical, and beyond reform. So I'll tell you the story of the house that modernity built. I'm focusing on the first frame. So there's a planet and a house that is on top of the planet, and we call this house the house that modernity built. And this house is exceeding the limits of the planet. It's becoming bigger than the planet. And this house has certain features. So the first feature we're going to talk about is separability, which is the foundation of the house. Separability separates us humans from nature, and us humans from the other animals. And it also creates hierarchies between different groups of humans. One carrying wall of this house is the nation state. The other carrying wall is universal reason. So we'll start with universal reason. Universal reason is a single story of progress, development, human evolution, and civilization. And this story is based on one single rationality. In this case, it's an Enlightenment rationality of traditions that came from Europe. But it's important to remember, too, that even in Europe, in the single story, as it was forming, it also eliminated other stories that were there before. So the single story of progress, development, human evolution, and civilization becomes the yardstick for the measure of progress in that carrying wall. The other carrying wall is the wall of the nation state. So we tend to think about the nation state as the institution that is there to protect the people of a territory, right? But actually, if you look at the origins of the nation state, the modern nation state was created to protect property and property owners. So in critical race theory, for example, we talk about the nation state as giving people's rights, like labor rights, civil rights, human rights, only when the rights of the people converged with the interests of the rights of property. So when there was interest convergence between giving people's rights and protecting property, the rights were given to the people. When there is no interest convergence, the state is there to protect property. And the last thing about this first frame of the house is the roof of the house, which is the current roof is what I would call algorithmic capitalism. That's the capitalism that uses data to manipulate what we are exposed to on Facebook, for example. But the origin of algorithmic capitalism is financial shareholder capitalism, which is different from industrial capitalism. But in any case, the roof of the house is problematic and it's leaking because in financial shareholder capitalism, what we have is a change in the relationship between the economy, the global economy, and the states. So the states have more difficulty regulating the economy. And shareholder capitalism means that a lot of anonymous people, including ourselves, right, in the investments of our pensions, in the use of our credit cards, we are invested in an economy that focuses solely on increasing profit for the shareholders. So the responsibility stability that maybe industrial capitalism seemed to have with the workers or the population, it disappears in shareholder financial capitalism, where the economy is a speculative economy, it's a betting economy, and these bets are the bets on disaster, on other people losing money. So at this point, I'll ask Will, would you like to add anything to this frame?
Yes, absolutely. They're coming from the perspective. So what I'll say is directed towards LFS students, but also parts of it are quite broad, regardless of where you are in this kind of superficial delineation of our different faculties. But in particular for our LFS students to think about how much or how deeply ingrained the house is in our day-to-day activities and in our understanding of our education, our scholarship, and why we are where we are, and what we're trying to take in our courses and what it's leading us towards. And so thinking about the enlightened humanism and science education and the scientific method of where that way of knowing came from and how it has been universalized and how that universalization, as Vanessa said, has pushed away or disappeared other ways of knowing, but also the power that it bestows upon people to be associated with science and science education, the scientific method. And so thinking about how deeply ingrained that narrative and the power of that narrative is, but how often we never really talk about it, even though we are in these institutions that are developing new scientists or new professionals based on evidence-based practices. So that a really interesting part of one of those walls is I want our LFS students to consider that, although that's pretty much broadly transferable to any student in any faculty in a modern university. It's the same pattern, regardless if it's science or not. It's still about how our universities reinforce this idea of certain ways of knowing and where that comes from. In terms of the nation state, and if you think for LFS, how often we talk about food security at certain geographic levels. So at the local level, the regional level, the national level, already seeing how we just don't even consider, taking for granted that the nation state is an imaginary, is a recent creation, and how, as Vanessa was saying, that recent creation isn't always just to bestow good things upon those who are within the boundaries, but often also to, through violences, maintain certain orders globally. And so we, in LFS and in food system movements, we have to talk about the value of local food or regional food. But to be honest, those boundaries are so much intertwined with the idea of a nation state and moving in and out from there. As another way of seeing how this house that modernity is built is infiltrating even how we think about framing positive or negative, or positive or ways we want to move away from in terms of food systems development. We do talk a little bit, not nearly enough, about capitalism and our industrial food systems and the commodification of key crops and certain crops like wheat, like soy, and corn, and the implications of that, the commodification and building a food system around industrialization and a capitalist ways of distribution, capitalist ways of accumulating profit, really inform but are rarely discussed in our curriculum in LFS. And to be honest, there are very few faculties of agriculture, faculties of nutrition, food science that do take a very hard critical view of capitalism as part of their core curriculum. It's always assumed that that's the way it is, and that's the way we'll be moving in the foreseeable future, but it's never really critiqued and shown to be connected to the nation state and our inherited way of knowing that we're reproducing in our faculties. So I'll pause right there and I'll bring the screen back, but I really want the LFS students to notice that our food system and how we're teaching and learning about food systems, especially from the natural science perspective, is embedded deeply within the house and helps reinforce what's even possible and what we can even consider as a viable way of moving forward from this position. So I'll pass it back to Vanessa and
thank you, Will. The same thing can be said about education. Education was created to maintain the logic of the house and to expand the house. So we're moving to the second frame, which is the hidden costs of the house. And this frame is about the house being subsidized and maintained by violence. So inside the house, you have unsustainable growth and overconsumption. And then there is an arrow bringing resources from the planet, what we would call resources from the planet, and then disposing the waste back onto the planet again, and those who are in the planet having their resources taken, extracted and taken away, and being subject to the dumping of the waste of the house, are experiencing dispossession, destitution, and genocide, so expropriation all around, right? So here, I think this frame talks about the fact that the costs of the creation of the house and the maintenance of the house are externalized to other populations. So those who enjoy the comforts of the house are not generally aware that these comforts happen at the expense of other populations. We generally think that it's an exclusion of other populations, but it's actually at the expense of other populations and of the planet itself. So, Will?
Yes, thank you. So I'm just getting a bit more familiar with the software using, so there'll be some pauses. By the end, we're going to be pros at this. So again, coming back to our food systems in LFS, the idea of in LFS 350, most of you are likely to have taken that, and we talk about in terms of the one supporting wall of enlightened humanism, we talk about epistemic justice. And we don't go deep enough into that concept. There's not only so much time we have in LFS 350, but that epistemic justice is about, again, whose knowledge matters, whose evidence matters, whose knowledges are disappeared or denigrated to support ways moving forward in the food system. And the violence of that process of epistemicide, as it's been called, considering that violence just in how we consider what type of knowledge matters. In terms of the nation state, again, for food systems, our discourse in LFS and broadly, globally, when we talk about global food systems, it's often framed through what can our nation do to support those within, and often at the expense of those who are outside. So Canada sets policy, agricultural plans, Canada sets and subsidizes certain agricultural industries to benefit Canadians. And we rarely talk about and really consider the violences that are incurred for the safeties and the securities that Canadians are benefiting from. Or at times, we will frame our harmful production processes that are driven by an industrial capitalist system and exporting our harmful agricultural products and processes, and to be honest with you, our harmful ways of doing agriculture, of growing food, processing food. So McCain's is a big global leader in fries production. So McCain's has taken their model to India, has transferred and transformed landscapes around their processing plants to make similar to what we've done in Canada, but taking it to India, getting Indian farmers to invest in the types of potatoes McCain wants, the types of machinery that needs, the types of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides that all require to feed into McCain's Canadian model. And it's just being exported. So often we win awards for this type of behavior, but consider the violences again, consider the erasures that happen when McCain lands and is often framed as a benevolent and caring corporation that is helping bring farmers into the modern era of production. But really, when we scratch just a little bit beneath the surface, that narrative doesn't really hold much water. So considering how the House allows folks to sanction ignorance about the harms while also causing violences, not just in the nation, but beyond. And that having a nation state really helps protect that narrative and reinforce the benevolence of the state. I'll pass it back over to Vanessa.
So the third frame of the house is the floors, right? It's interesting because this frame actually came from the communities that we were workshopping this cartography with, and they really wanted to talk about the dynamics within the house and between the house and those who are not inside of the house. So inside the house, then, you will have three levels. And here we're playing with the ideas of global north and global south. So global north is usually associated with high income countries or richer people, and global north with low income countries and people who have been imposed poverty, right? So at the top of the house, the north of the north, that's the penthouse, there are people who have had historical wealth. So they have a lot of discretionary funds, and they're not really worried about losing this wealth. And it's generally wealth that was extracted from other people through colonialism, imperialism, and other forms of oppression too. So, and then in the second frame of the house, you have the north of the south. So these are people who are invested in social mobility. So these are the stairs of social mobility. These are people who want to get to a place of the north where they do not have to worry about wealth or losing wealth. And then there's the south of the north, which is the basement of the house, which is where communities, generally communities of immigrants, and generally communities that do all the services like that the north of the north doesn't want to do, because the north of the north would be the professionals, right? So these communities, they may not be necessarily invested in social mobility, but they are invested in the securities of the house and building their own communities within the house. And then there is the south of the south, in the sewage of the house going into the planet. So the south of the south are those who are fighting to be able to live a different kind of life that is not in this kind of house. But when the house makes it impossible for them to have their livelihoods, the safest place for them to go is the house itself, right? So the south of the south is also the people who, when their livelihoods are made unviable, they are going to knock on the house door and say, "We want in. You destroyed our place. Now you have to give us shelter." Right? We are here because you were there. You came and you took things from us and you dumped your stuff on us, and now we can't live there anymore. We have to come here. So this frame talks about also the false promise of universal middle class for all. So the house promises that everybody will be able to go up the stairs and reach the north of the north. However, for everybody to reach the north of the north, the amount of violence that this house will have to inflict on the planet and on other people is enormous. So we are made to think that the best way of living is the way of living that is promoted in the house, but this way of living is dependent on extraction, expropriation, destitution, and destruction somewhere else. And this fact is erased and denied. That's the sanctioning ignorance that we've been talking about. And therefore, the promise of universal middle class for all, that everybody will be able to be within the house, and the house will be able to expand enough to get everybody in the house, is also a false promise. So back to Will.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. So this there's so many layers in this, and we could spend years just on these slides. But I want to point out the direct relationship to going to university in these days. Also, the critique of going to university is that university is no longer a guarantee of climbing the ladders of that social progress as it once was. And even then, it wasn't really for everyone. It was only for certain people of a certain class, gender, race. But now it's still being sold as go to university and you can climb that ladder. The other part is I want to point out in this is the south of the north. So thinking about our temporary foreign like in BC, we actually have our temporary foreign workers program that's supported by the federal government, supported by the provincial government, and those are the people who are allowed into Canada to do the work that most Canadians don't want to do, and they do it at a subsidized rate, and a rate that, to be honest, many stories in the media talk about folks coming in, migrants coming in to work on farms, having their passports taken back, having very poor living conditions. A lot of issues around COVID-19 spread this past year because of the living conditions, because of the lack of healthcare, because of the lack of rights that are granted by the nation to come and do the work that others have often called the 3Ds, the dirty, the dangerous, and the demeaning work that is prevalent through our food system. So on farms, in meat processing plants, even in Tim Hortons, and I'm not saying Tim Hortons is dirty, demeaning, dirty or dangerous, but a number of people would call it demeaning work. And Tim Hortons applies for temporary foreign workers to come and bring workers in. And they'll say, oh, it's a labor shortage. Canadians don't want these jobs. So they will use, so does McDonald's. So you can see in almost all parts of the food system, we benefit from the south of the north being there. And once you start seeing this, you'll see it every part of the food system that's hidden out of our sights. It's often you won't see it. You won't see it at Whole Foods, but it's what's propping up Whole Foods. You won't see it at the fancy restaurants, but it's there. It's all. If you just look just a bit under the surface, you'll see all of these patterns showing up all throughout the food system.
And then we have the last frame, the structural damage of the house, right? So you have climate change on top of the roof, economic instability, the cancellation of rights, precarity, populist governments being democratically elected in many places. And then inside the house, you have social, economic, political, ecological, and mental health crisis. And then in the planet, violent conflict and mass enforced migration. So the question here is, do we fix the house? Do we expand the house? Do we build another house? Do you live without a house? Do we find another planet? And then now I have my dog wanting to stand up. So I will pass it back to Will.
And unfortunately, right now we are, I think it's unequivocal evidence of these fissures and cracks in the house. So starting with the COVID-19 pandemic and really the unavoidable economic harms. Some people have benefited, some people have managed to escape the economic harms that came with COVID-19, but it would be very hard to try to convince someone now that our previous and our current economic system isn't unbelievably vulnerable. And then we move on to the racial reckoning of George Floyd and beyond within the summer of 2020, pointing out again that there are some underlying deep tensions and harms that exist that are propping up the system and becoming more and more hard to pretend that that's not happening everywhere. The discovery of 215 bodies in Kamloops, unmarked graves of children, again, not allowing Canadians to deny that residential schools weren't harmful to an unimaginable degree, as well as our recent heat dome, the heat wave we've had in Vancouver, again, pushing people to recognize climate change is real. It's like kind of, as I was looking at the House Modernity Bill, I was thinking to myself, and I know that the north of the north certainly has air conditioning because it's getting very uncomfortable up there with climate change, but that's okay if you've got the cash to help control that system. And then thinking about the implications of climate or of air conditioning becoming normalized globally and what the implications will be beyond the house and ecologically. So I think right now is a really interesting time, and it's interesting in a way that acknowledges the deeply systemic harms and violences of this system. But these cracks and fissures, I'd say a few years back, people were more able to deny, to deflect, to try to gaslight folks for saying, no, this, it's not that bad. And actually, if we just have to tweak the system, it's going to work for everyone. Just wait. I don't think that, well, there's still that message out there, but it's harder to say that publicly and be considered a reliable source of anything these days. So a bit of an interesting pivot we're in right now, a transition point. Who knows how it's going to stay, but it just kind of reinforces, I would say, the wisdom of this cartography of showing, and in some ways, not predicting, because these issues have been here since the beginning, but really making it clear how we can understand what's going on in terms of this collection of issues coming up right now, but how they're historically connected and how they've been with us for so long.
So there are many things we can analyze and examine as we face the house cracking and shaking and sometimes collapsing, right? And it's important to mention that when we talk about social and ecological collapse in the global north, people have different responses to it, but they're thinking about something that hasn't happened yet. But if we remember that social and ecological collapse happens in other places to sustain the house, to maintain the house, that changes the question a little bit. So today we're going to present a second tool that shows how people think about change when they're thinking about the house. So there are three approaches, basically, when we get to the point where we see the cracks of the house. And we talk about them in terms of soft reform of the house, radical reform of the house, or the house beyond reform. So in terms of soft reform of the house, this is an orientation and approach to the house where we think that better data, better policies, and better leadership will just keep the house together, fix the cracks, and even help expand the house. So here we have the same old questions about how to maintain the house and the same forward to expand the house. Now, radical reform is different. It talks about different perspectives, different bodies involved in the different levels of the house, and different leadership. So here you would have, for example, BIPOC leadership, EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? The questions are different. There are different questions, but the forward is the same. It's still the idea of expanding the house, but with different leadership. Then we have the orientation or the approach of beyond reform. And here there are three different options within beyond reform, three different approaches, sub-approaches within the same approach. Number one is the replacement of the house by a radical alternative with a guarantee. So people would say, we don't need this house, we need this other house, a replacement house. And they already know what this house looks like. And the idea is that this other house that they already know is better than the house that the house of modernity, the house that is cracking, that exists. Then their second option is hacking the house, using the materials of the house to build something better. But this idea is that we already know what better looks like, and it's not what was in the house. And then there's the third option, which is hospicing, which is assisting this house to die with integrity and assisting the birth of something else, something new, from learning the lessons that the death of this house has provided. So this is a much more uncertain process because it doesn't claim to know what the better is from the outset, or that we already know what better is. It's one that says we need to be wrestling with this as the house falls apart. So in the three approaches of beyond reform, we have different questions and different forwards. So they're all looking for other types of shelter. So back to Will.
I think this one, again, this cartography is so helpful for the Faculty of Land and Food Systems and thinking about the types of courses and curriculum and the types of visions that we offer within the faculty. And again, this isn't a critique. This is acknowledging that we're experiencing something unprecedented and we don't know what to do. Although in some ways, the university needs to propose itself, needs to position itself in society as knowing what to do. Follow us. We have the data. We have the approach. We're objective. We're applying a scientific method, and we're using rationality to make decisions and transparency. That is not that is a helpful approach for certain types of problems, but at the same time, we need to recognize that we're in many ways addicted to the idea of certainty that comes from that narrative. And so I'm jumping a little bit to the beyond reform and touching upon what Vanessa just pointed out, is that the challenge with beyond reform is that we are still deeply socialized to be comforted and to seek out and to defend and to fight for certainty. And certainty is not a part of complexity. And what we're experiencing is this layering of complexity in so many different ways that this socialization towards certainty is one of our biggest barriers. And we will talk about that throughout the course. But just to highlight that certainty is both built up and maintains the soft reform, the radical reform, and makes the beyond reform almost unintelligible, unlegible, when certainty and control is part of our defaults, or part of our being that helps move us and motivate us and compel us to action. But in terms of soft reform,
and it is the being, it is the being that the house has conditioned, right? So it's not the natural being of all human beings. It's the being that grew up within the house and with the promises of the house.
And that the house has reinforced and has made it to look like this is what reality should be, could be, and needs to be in order for us to continue along our journey of expanding the house and getting everyone up onto the top floor. Although secretly we're going to pull the ladder up anyways. So soft reform, though, if you think about the types of way we frame certain problems and certain approaches in land and food systems, it's acknowledging, well, we know monocultures are ecologically devastating, but perhaps if we just use fewer pesticides, then overall we would pollute less and there'd be less harm, or fewer any form of chemicals that we apply in our industrial food systems to maintain monoculture. So let's not lose the monoculture, because that's how we feed the world. But we're just going to tweak around the edges to minimize the harm. And to be honest with you, that again, that is very important, because we need to minimize the harm in the system. But again, will that actually address the issues that are being presented by what the House is proposing? And the same with the radical reform. So knowing that the House is strategically designed and strategically fought for, the radical reform is an interesting position, because it's allowing the promises that are embedded within the House to allow other people in, but still working for the same goals that the House has always been trying to propose. And so in food systems as well, when we are just allowing a different group with a different set of knowledges to take the lead and maintain our capitalist industrial system, not much change is going to happen, even though the external visibility and even the redistribution of some of our resources might be more equitably distributed, or more decision-making power is allowed in different forms. But if we're still within the House and maintaining the House, figuratively, metaphorically, how much reform will we have, and ultimately will we be able to maintain life on this planet, essentially, as the greatest question. And so beyond reform, I would say in our faculty is unknown, both because beyond reform for most of us in our current society is unknown, but there's been very few gestures even towards it, or even considerations of it in a serious way. So I struggle to find examples that make sense within our academic realm, within our scholarly field, that take seriously and can actually make beyond reform make sense and to be invested in to go further. I would say that we are lucky to be in radical reform in certain ways. It is progress and it is minimizing certain harms, but for the most part, beyond reform is not legible where we're at right now.
It's interesting in education too. It's much more radical. Like mostly it's soft reform. Some of it is radical reform, but beyond reform, we see a lot of initiatives on the fringes trying to do something very different, like the Shishkanta University in India. There's also the University of the Forest of the Hunikuit people. So they're trying, but it's very hard to come up with an alternative that that doesn't reproduce the same kinds of contradictions, right? So one of the things that is important to keep in mind from the beginning of the course, and we will look at that more on in Unit 6, is to approach these alternatives not looking for models of success, but actually looking for the learning and the failures and the contradictions. And I think that is actually a good way where we can conclude the session with this idea of failing forward. Back to Will.
Perfect. Yeah, so we just want to put a few, there's so much in the House and in the soft radical reform cartography. So if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed and maybe even struggling to remember what the beginning was, although we haven't spent much time together yet, that's okay. That's part of this process, as there's a lot in here and it takes a bit of time for it to sink in. So I'd say two quick takeaways. One is the tools and toys. So these are analytical tools. These are frameworks that you can apply to help analyze current examples, models, ways of being. But that we also want to we want to frame them also as toys, because when you're using a toy, failure isn't part of play. And it's a really important part of this process in learning this way and being involved in a course like that, is that there's no failure. Failure comes when we decide to step away and not come back at all and say, I can't deal with this too much. I mean, that's okay to recognize if it's affecting you beyond your capacity, because the material is quite intense and heavy and sneaks up on you at sometimes, or it hits you very quickly. So in those moments, step back. But if it's just because it's uncomfortable, that I would say is a bit of a failure. But for the most part, what we're saying here is need to play with this in a productive way, in a productive failure way, in a way that fails forward, because you have to come back to this material. You have to let the layers sink in. You have to realize that your first understanding is good but limited, and the next one round is good but limited, and it comes with feedback, and it comes with often saying things that are inaccurate or are missing certain layers, and then receiving that feedback and coming back. So it's about that failing forward that will really help you develop the stamina to stick with the challenge of engaging with these types of cartographies. And in particular, for those who are socialized within STEM faculties, faculties of natural science, so I'm looking at you, the LFSers, we often, failure is one of our cardinal sins. And so recognize that it's deep within you. You can say to yourself, oh, it's okay to fail, but really you're socialized to be very against failure. And you're gonna have to work through that. And we're not saying this isn't an excuse to say anything goes, but just to recognize that with this material, failing forward is necessary. And so that's why we bring this idea of toys into it, just to soften the exploration, just to allow us the time and the opportunity to let this settle in and keep going. The one other thing I'd like to say as we move on, for me personally, when I encountered this material and this particular denial, the first time, and even still, this is one of the denials that for me really makes me curl in, makes me constrict, makes me kind of hold my breath sometimes when it's settling in and dawning with the complicity and the level of violence that is embodied in this cartography of the House Modernity Bill. It was for me, it still is for me, a bodily, a somatic form of violence that I'm experiencing. So I'm not subjected to the violence of the House, but recognizing the complicity and letting this cartography sink in affects my body. It affects my mood. It affects my relationships at times, and I recognize it now, and I have ways of managing it. But if you're feeling from this material, acknowledging and letting the complicity sink in, do expect it to land in your body and to linger for days, sometimes weeks, and get used to moving it through, not erasing it, not denying it, but moving it through your body, usually through movement, usually through ways that help you come back to the material. But do expect this week's complicity of violence and understanding the step of violence to have an impact on you, and be gentle with yourself. If it's getting too much, pull back, do an activity that helps recenter, and then please come back to the material and engage in that way. But I just wanted to say that because for me, this one still happens. And I also see it too, for example, with how the Catholic Church and how the Canada has been, some officials with each of these institutions will acknowledge complicity and some will not. Some will refuse to acknowledge complicity in the historical and ongoing violences of our colonial system. And it reinforces the importance of recognizing this denial, because it is used all the time to justify this system. So recognize, start seeing, and start listening for how folks are not acknowledging the complicity in historical and current forms of harm as a way to maintain the House, as a way to safeguard and to prop up the House and to push back against any critique, because it is very, very real, and it's happening all the time right now as we're talking about the different fissures and the confluence of different events going on, from COVID-19, economic, racial equity, acknowledging colonialism and climate change. Denial of the complicity is everywhere. So that's it for me. I'll pass it back to Vanessa. Any closing thoughts? And then we will see you back again in tutorial and our other recorded sessions. Vanessa?
So you will be asked to use this tool in the questions that are related to the readings, to the documentary, in the other exercises of the course. And I think that's it, Will. I think we're going to conclude by talking a little bit about analysis and failing forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so ongoing, the House and the cartography will be introducing a few more throughout the course, but these are the central cartographies. And again, for one last thing I want to say about this to STEM folks is that cartographies are not meant to be accurate representations of reality. Vanessa said that at the beginning, but it's really important. If you find yourself arguing that, well, is it really capitalism that is the roof and maybe it should be that is a deflection. We're not saying don't engage in critique, of course, but recognize that sometimes for STEM folks, critiquing the details is a way of not getting into or letting what is being brought forward settle in. It's a defense mechanism. It's normal, and it's very pronounced in STEM culture. And you have been enculturated and socialized within STEM. So just recognize at times when you're saying this is this isn't accurate. They're not meant to be accurate. They're meant to put out a collection of concepts, images in a way that moves something in you, and then from that movement is where you learn. Why am I being affected this way? Why am I resisting this idea that I might be complicit? I'm a nice person. So recognize when the cartographies are presented, they aren't accurate representations of reality. At another time, we could talk about, is there such a thing? But what they are meant to do is to move us and to learn from that. And so that's a bit different than what we often do in LFS or natural sciences in terms of pedagogies and curriculum. And that's okay. And so we appreciate that you're here for this, but just recognize that the cartographies that we'll be using and coming back to aren't meant to be representations of reality. I guess I'll just probably repeat that a whole bunch of different times. It took me a long time to overcome that. And we do see it when we bring this type of material to our other colleagues who are in STEM, that is often the first place to go, is to pick apart the details in order to avoid getting into the implications. So if you see yourself doing that, don't feel bad. Just
don't
recognize
invest
it.
though.
Don't invest in it. Yeah.
Yes.
Don't invest in it. Don't let it take you away. Recognize it's happening. Come back. Think about what else is going on. And the last thing I'll say too is that numbness or feeling nothing is also a sensation. And for many people, it's one of the most problematic sensations. It's a protective way for your body to say, I'm not dealing with this right now. I'm going to not let you feel anything. So it doesn't mean you're not affected. It often means that your body's protecting you from future or from current harms, but it compiles and can show up in different ways later. So if you're like, well, I don't really feel anything right now, or I'm feeling kind of numb, that's a feeling. That's a somatic response, and be aware of it, be attentive to it. And just these aren't what we say when we talk about our body responses. They're not fixed. We're not going to fix anything. We're just going to be learning from them.
And that's what I wanted to say for the education folks too.
Mm-hmm.
So generally we think about education as a process to arrive somewhere. This is not about arriving. This is about learning to walk or to dance or to move or to breathe together in a foggy road full of potholes that we can very easily fall into. So this is not the same kind of education you've been used to that arrives at a destination. This is an education to be able to walk differently, to show up differently together in a road that it's going to get more difficult. We usually talk about storms coming, and the idea is to be able to go towards the storm together, to get to the eye of the storm and to walk with the storm. If you walk too fast, you get caught in the vortex. If you walk too slow, you get caught in the vortex as well. So that's why, as I said in the agreements video, it's counterintuitive, right? You are going to feel it's a bit weird in the beginning. And if you feel it's weird, go back to the course agreements, go back to the explanation of the bus methodology, and you will find some tools there that will help you move these feelings through you and help you have a very different idea of your responses and of yourself in relation to the issue. So with that, I'm going to leave you. We're going to leave you with the two tools and invite you to do all the exercises that are available in the learning bundle. Thank you.
Thank you.